want to talk a little bit about what a typical experimental measurement would look like using a C4 bandpass filter. Now, part of this would be very typical if you pull down the examples files on the FPA tools. What you're going to find is we have all, that we're going to have a typical block, which will have a nice C4 block. You'll have some ADC component. There'll be a DC voltage block. All of this of which you can select a nice voltage in between the rails. There's a bunch of parameters here, kind of discussed in another video, but again, that's sort of what the basic C4 block is. And then there's an arbitrary waveform generator, which basically lets you take a vector, say, sitting in Scilab, or you could be generating from other places and directly putting it in there. And it directly gets put in there, sampled in, and go. And you think, okay, great, nicely abstracted, works really well, don't have to think too much about it. Just pull this down and it works. And then you might be asking, well, I'm actually kind of curious what's going on, because there's a couple parameters that might just be defaults, but you just kind of see the simple block and it just seems like it works. And yet if you look a little closer, there's a lot more detail. There's a lot of detail for the C4 block. That's sort of covered in a different video, but just to get a sense of what else is going on here. Well, one, there's a DC voltage because I need to have a parameter in the C4 block, typically mid-rail kind of range. And the way that's done is it's DC voltage block, sort of a level 1 block, but what you find is it is basically a floating gate OTA that's sort of sitting in somewhere, that's compiled in there. And it basically looks like a follower configuration, but it's connected to VDD. And you look at this and you think, that's really weird, because that means the output is VDD, right? Well, not quite, because it'll depend on where is the charge, the plus and minus charge sitting there. It also has a pretty decent current drive, so you could actually drive a decent level circuits afterwards. We don't need it here, but it just kind of works. And so it basically sets a voltage. Now, when you actually click on the DC voltage, it'll ask you for what is the voltage, not the charge. It just abstracts it for you because it's a pretty well understood block, and you can just abstract it all out. Great. So you think, okay, that may be a little more complicated, but all good. Well, if I put into an ADC, it actually compiles up a ramp ADC, and the ramp ADC structure looks like this on chip, where you actually have a current source integrating onto a capacitor, which creates the ramp. You actually have the input, you sweep across it, and then at some point when this comparator trips, you keep counting. When something breaks, it then comes back and resets the system. So this is kind of an interesting block because it has a bunch of analog components, but then it also goes into the interrupt generator, into the microprocessor, where I'm doing a count on this. Now there's a couple of different ways this is built. This is one of many possible ways that it may be there. There may be some advanced things that are built later on, but just to give you a sense of what one of these blocks looks like, this is what happens. And if I look at the arbitrary waveform generator, even more interesting, because now it's going to say I'm going to take that arbitrary waveform, convert it into some elements into SRAM, so it's a whole bunch of SRAM values. This now will get read by the microprocessor. There's assembly code that's structured to be able to handle this, that now sends the values to some of the on-chip DACs, which that now gets routed to this output point, which basically means it goes to that signal. You just think that there's a vector and you go from there, but there's a whole bunch of pieces in this. And I bring this up because it's really important to notice how much abstraction is going on in what seems like a very simple bandpass filter measurement. And notice that things are going to be compiling, compile to routing, analog blocks, signal DACs, digital blocks, microprocessor code, and what looks like a very nice, innocuous little block. And it's amazing that you can do this. And for those who say, well, analog is not abstractable, I would tend to disagree. I think that we have a great opportunity in most of these cases.